The story of a common soldier of Army life in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865 by Leander Stillwell is a vivid first-hand account of an ordinary Union soldier's journey from enlistment to the harsh realities of battle and camp life. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. These are Stillwell's words. Let's begin. General Sherman soon drove General Johnston out of Jackson and beyond the Pearl River, and then his column returned to the vicinity of Vicksburg. On July 22, our division marched back to Snyder's Bluff and resumed our old camp. But we had not been there long before rumors began circulating that we were under marching orders and would soon leave for some point in Arkansas. Sure enough, on July 29, we marched to the Yazoo River, filed on board the sidewheel steamer Sultana, steamed down the river to its mouth, and then turned up the Mississippi, heading north. I will remark here that one of the most tragic and distressing incidents of the war was directly connected with a frightful disaster that later befell the above-named steamboat. It left Vicksburg for the north on or about April 25, 1865, having on board nearly 1,900 Union soldiers, all of whom, with few exceptions, were paroled prisoners. On the morning of April 27, while near Memphis, the boilers of the boat exploded, and it was burned to the water's edge. Over 1,100 of these unfortunate men perished in the wreck in different ways, some scalded to death by escaping steam, some by fire, and others, the greatest number, by drowning. Besides the soldiers, cabin passengers and members of the boat's crew, numbering about 140, also perished. It was the greatest disaster of that kind that ever occurred on the Mississippi. It may, perhaps, be noticed that the regiment is leaving the vicinity of Vicksburg without my saying a word about the appearance of that celebrated stronghold at that time. There is a good reason for this, namely, it so happened that we never entered the place. We were close to it, on the north and on the east, but that was all. I have never yet seen Vicksburg, and it is not probable now that I ever shall. We arrived at Helena, Arkansas, on July 31, debarked, and went into camp near the bank of the river, about 2 miles below the town. There were no trees in our camp except a few cottonwoods. The ground on which we walked, sat, and slept was, in the main, just a mass of hot sand, and we got water for drinking and cooking purposes from the Mississippi River. The country back of the town and in the immediate vicinity was wild and thinly settled and had already been well foraged, so we were restricted to the ordinary army diet, of which one of the principal items, as usual, was fat sowbelly. I never understood why we were not allowed to camp in the woods west of the town. There was plenty of high, well-shaded space there, and we could have quickly sunk wells that would have furnished cool, palatable water. But this was not done, and the regiment remained for about 2 weeks camped on the riverbank under the conditions described above. A natural result was that many of the men were prostrated by malarial fever, and this time I happened to be one of them. I now approach a painful period of my army career. I just lay there, in a hot tent, on the sand, oh, so sick. But I fought off going to the hospital as long as possible. I had a superstitious dread of an army hospital. I had seen so many of the boys loaded into ambulances and hauled off to such places, never to return, that I was determined never to go to one if it could be avoided in any honorable way. But the time came when it became a military necessity for me to go, and there was no alternative. The campaign that was in contemplation was a movement westward against the Confederates under General Sterling Price at Little Rock, with the intention of capturing that place and driving the Confederates from the state. The officer in command of the Union forces was General Frederick Steele. Marching orders were issued, fixing August 13 as the day our regiment would start. All the sick who were unable to march, and I was among that number, were to be sent to the division hospital. So, on the morning before the regiment moved, an ambulance drove up to my tent, and some of the boys carried me out and put me in the vehicle. Captain Keeley was standing by. He pressed my hand and said, "Goodbye, Stillwell. Brace up. You'll be all right soon." I was feeling too wretched to talk much. I only said, "Goodbye, Captain," and let it go at that. Later, when I rejoined the regiment, Keeley told me that when he bade me goodbye that morning, he never expected to see me again. Our division hospital, to which I was taken, consisted of a little village of wall tents on the outskirts of Helena. The tents were arranged in rows, with perhaps 15 to 20 in a row, with their ends pinned back against the sides, thus making an open space down an entire row. The sick men lay on cots, with a line on each side of the interior of the tents and a narrow all between them. I remained at the hospital for 8 days and was very sick most of the time, retaining a distinct recollection of only a few things. But aside from men dying all around me, both day and night, nothing important happened. All the accounts I have read of General Steele's movement on Little Rock agree in stating that the number of men he left sick at Helena and other places between there and Little Rock was extraordinary and beyond all usual proportions. From what I saw myself, I think these statements must be true. A necessary consequence of this high number of sick soldiers was that it must have been impossible to give the invalids the care and attention they should have received. We had few attendants, and they were soldiers detailed for that purpose, too feeble to march but supposedly capable of rendering hospital service. The medical force left with us was so scanty that it was totally inadequate for the duties they were called on to perform. Oh, those nights were so long! At intervals in the aisle, a bayonet would be stuck in the ground with a lighted candle in its socket, and when a light went out, say after midnight, it stayed out, and we would toss around on those hard cots in a state of semi-darkness until daylight. If any attendants moved around among us in the later hours of the night, I never saw them. We had well water to drink, which, of course, was better than that from the river, but it would soon become insipid and warm, and sometimes, especially during the night, we didn't have enough of it. On one occasion, about midnight, soon after I was taken to the hospital, I was burning with fever and became intolerably thirsty for a drink of water. No attendants were in sight, and the candles had all gone out except for one or two, which emitted only a flickering light that barely served to render darkness visible. My suffering became well-nigh unbearable, and I could stand it no longer. I got up and staggered to the door of the tent. Looking about me, I saw a light gleaming through a tent that stood apart from the others. I made my way to it as best I could and went inside. A young fellow, maybe an assistant surgeon, was seated at the far end of a little desk, writing. My entrance was so quiet that he did not hear me, and walking up to him, I said in a hollow voice, "I want a drink of water." The fellow dropped his pen and nearly fell off his stool. The only garment I had on was a white, flimsy cotton bedgown, which they garbed us all in when we were taken to the hospital. His eyes, as he stared at me, looked as if they would pop out of his head. Perhaps he thought I was a gliding ghost. But he quickly got me some water, and I drank copiously. I don't clearly remember what followed. It seems to me that this man helped me back to my tent, but I am not sure. However, I was in the same old cot the next morning. The fare at the hospital was not of a nature liable to generate an attack of gout, but I reckon those in charge did the best they could. The main thing seemed to be a kind of thin soup, with some grains of rice or barley in it. What the basis of it was, I don't know. I munched a hardtack occasionally, which was far better than the soup. But my appetite was quite scanty, anyhow. One day, at dinner, we each had about 2 or 3 tablespoonfuls of preserved currants, served in our tin plates, for which it was said we were indebted to the U.S. Sanitary Commission. It seemed that a boatload of such goods came down the river, in charge of a committee of ladies, destined for our hospitals at Vicksburg. The boat happened to make a temporary stop at Helena, and the ladies, learning that there was great need of sanitary supplies at the hospitals there, donated the bulk of their cargo to us. I will remark here that that little dab of currants was all the U.S. sanitary stuff I consumed during my army service. I am not complaining, merely stating the fact. Those goods very properly went to the hospitals, and as my stay therein was brief, my share of the delicacies was correspondingly slight. As for the medicine given to us in the hospital at Helena, my recollection is that it was almost entirely quinine, and the doses were frequent and copious, which I suppose was all right. There was a boy in my company about my age, a tall, lanky chap named John Barton. He had lived in our neighborhood at home, and we were well acquainted before our enlistment. He was a kind-hearted, good sort of fellow, but he had, while in the army, one unfortunate weakness, a voracious appetite for intoxicating liquor. And he had a remarkable faculty for getting the stuff, under any and all circumstances. He could nose it out in some way as surely and readily as a bear could find a bee tree. To keep the record straight, I will say that after his discharge, he turned over a new leaf, quit drinking whiskey, and lived a strictly temperate life. He was under the weather when the regiment left Helena, so he was detailed to serve as a nurse at the hospital and was thus engaged in my tent. Since making that bad break at Owl Creek, I had avoided whiskey as if it were a rattlesnake, but somehow, while here in the hospital, I began to feel an intense craving for some spiritus frumentae, as the surgeons called it. So one day, I asked John Barton if he could get me a canteen full of whiskey. He said he didn't know, was afraid it would be a difficult job, but to give him my canteen, and he would try. That night, as late as 1 or 2 o'clock, when the lights were nearly all out, as usual, I heard someone stealthily walking up the aisle, stopping occasionally at different cots. Presently, I heard a hoarse whisper, "Stillwell. Stillwell. Here." I answered in the same tone. The speaker then came to me. It was old John. Stooping down, he whispered, "By God, I've got it." "Bully for you, John," said I. He raised me to a sitting posture, removed the cork, and put the mouth of the canteen to my lips, and I drank about as long as I could hold my breath. John took a moderate swig himself, then carefully put the canteen in my knapsack, which was serving as my pillow, cautioned me to keep it concealed to avoid its being stolen, and went away. I was asleep about 5 minutes after my head struck my knapsack and slept the rest of the night just like a baby. When I woke up, I felt better and wanted something to eat. However, let no one think, who may read these lines, that I favor the use of whiskey as a medicine, for I don't. But the situation in those Helena hospitals was unusual and abnormal. The water was bad, our food was no good and very unsatisfactory, and the conditions generally were simply wretched. I am not blaming the military authorities. They doubtless did the best they could. It seemed to me that I was getting weaker every day. It looked as if something had to be done, and acting on the maxim that desperate cases require desperate remedies, I resorted, for the time being, to the whiskey treatment. I made one unsuccessful attempt afterward to get some to serve as a tonic, which perhaps may be mentioned later, and then forever abandoned the use of the stuff for any purpose. Immediately after this incident, the fever let up on me, and I began to get better, though still very weak. My great concern now was to rejoin the regiment just as soon as possible. It was taking part in an active campaign, in which fighting was expected, and the idea was intolerable that the other boys should be at the front, marching and fighting, while I was in the rear, playing the part of a hospital pimp. It was reported that a steamboat was going to leave soon, via the Mississippi and White Rivers, with convalescents for Steele's army, and I made up my mind to go on that boat at all hazards. But to accomplish that, it was necessary, as I was informed, to get a written permit from the division surgeon, Major Shubal York of the 54th Illinois Infantry. So, one morning, bright and early, I blacked my shoes, brushed up my old cap and clothing generally, and started to Major York's headquarters to get the desired permission. He was occupying a large 2-story house, with shade trees in the yard, in the residential part of town, and his office was in the parlor on the first floor of the building. I walked in and found an officer of the rank of major seated at a table, engaged in writing. I removed my cap, stood at attention, saluted him, and asked if this was Major York. I was answered in the affirmative. I had my little speech carefully prepared and proceeded at once to deliver it as follows. My name is Leander Stillwell. I am a sergeant of Company D, 61st Illinois Infantry, which is now with General Steele's army. The regiment marched about a week ago, and, as I was then sick with a fever, I could not go and was sent to the division hospital here in Helena. I am now well and have come to request a permit to rejoin my regiment. The major looked at me closely while I was speaking, and after I had concluded, he remained silent for a few seconds, still scrutinizing me intently. Then he said, in a low and very kind tone, "Why, Sergeant, you are not able for duty, and won't be for some time. Stay here till you get a little stronger." His statement was a bitter disappointment to me. I stood there in silence for a little while, twisting and turning my old, faded, and battered cap with trembling hands. I finally managed to say, "I want to go to my regiment," and here my lips began to tremble, and I got no further. Now, don't laugh at this. It was simply the case of a boy, weak and broken down by illness, who was homesick to be with his comrades. The major did not immediately respond to my last remark but continued to look at me intently. Presently, he picked up his pen and said, "I am inclined to think that the best medical treatment for you is to let you go to your regiment." He thereupon wrote and handed me the permit, which was quite brief, consisting only of a few lines. I thanked him and departed with a light heart. I will digress here for a moment to chronicle, with deep sorrow, the sad fate that ultimately befell the kind and noble surgeon, Major York. While he, with his regiment, was home on veteran furlough in March 1864, an organized gang of copperheads made a dastardly attack on some of the soldiers of the regiment at Charleston, Illinois, and murdered Major York and 5 privates. They also severely wounded the colonel, Greenville M. Mitchell, and 3 privates. See Official Records, War of the Rebellion, Serial Number 57, page 629, et seq. The war ended over half a century ago, and the feelings and passions engendered thereby, as between the people of the nation and those of the late Confederate States, have well-nigh wholly subsided, which is right. But nevertheless, I will set it down here that, in my opinion, the most undesirable citizens that ever afflicted our country were the traitorous, malignant breed that infested some portions of the loyal states during the war, and were known as copperheads. The rattlesnake gives warning before it strikes, but the copperhead snake, of equally deadly venom, gives none, and the two-legged copperheads invariably pursued the same course. They deserve the name. On leaving Major York's office, I returned to the hospital and gathered up my stuff, which included my gun, cartridge box, knapsack, haversack, and canteen, and said goodbye to Barton and the other boys I knew. Then I went to the commissary tent, and, exhibiting my permit, was furnished with 5 days' rations of hardtack, bacon, coffee, and sugar. From there, I made my way to the river landing and boarded the steamboat Pike, which was to take the present batch of convalescents to Steele's army. On the morning of August 21st, the Pike cast off and started down the Mississippi River. On reaching the mouth of White River, we turned up that stream, and on August 26th arrived at Devall's Bluff, on the west bank, where we debarked. Our trip from Helena was slow and uneventful. The country along White River from its mouth to Devall's Bluff was wild, very thinly settled, and practically in a state of nature. We passed only 2 towns on the stream, St. Charles and Clarendon, both small places. On different occasions, I saw several bears and deer on the riverbank, they having come there for water. Of course, they ran back into the woods when the boat got near them. All of Steele's infantry was temporarily in camp at Devall's Bluff, while his cavalry was some miles further out. I soon found the old regiment and received a warm welcome from all of Company D. They were much surprised to see me, as they had no idea that I would be able to leave the hospital so soon. They had had no fighting on this campaign so far, and they said that their march across the country from Helena had been monotonous and devoid of any special interest. During my first night at Devall's Bluff, there came a heavy and protracted rainstorm, and on waking up the following morning, I found myself about half hip deep in a puddle of water. And this was the beginning of more trouble. My system was full of quinine taken to break the fever while in the hospital, and the quinine and this soaking in the water did not agree. In a short time, I began to feel acute rheumatic twinges in the small of my back, and in a day or two, I was practically helpless and could not get up or walk around without assistance. The regiment left Devall's Bluff with the balance of the army on September 1st, advancing towards Little Rock. I was totally unable to march but was determined to go along some way, and with Captain Keeley's permission, the boys put me into one of the regimental wagons. This wagon happened to be loaded with barrels of pickled pork, standing on end, and my seat was on top of one of the barrels. It was just the hardest, most painful day's ride in a wagon I ever endured. I was suffering intensely from acute rheumatism in the coupling region, and in this condition, trying to keep steady on the top of a barrel while being occasionally violently pitched against the ends of the barrel staves when the wagon lurched into a deep rut, gave me well-nigh intolerable pain. To make matters worse, the day was very hot, so when evening came and the column halted, I was mighty near all in. But some of the boys helped me out, laid me on my blanket in the shade, and later brought me some supper of hardtack, bacon, and coffee. Except for the rheumatism, I was all right and had a good appetite, and after a hearty supper, I felt better. The next morning, in consequence of the active exertions of Captain Keeley in the matter, an ambulance drove up where I was lying, and I was loaded into it, and oh, it was a luxury. Poor Enoch Wallace had been taken down with a malarial fever, and he was also a passenger, along with 2 other soldiers whose names I have forgotten. Enoch had been promoted to 2nd lieutenant and had been acting as such for some months, but his commission was not issued until September 3rd, a day when he was a very sick man. From this point on, until September 10th, the day our forces captured Little Rock, my days were spent in the ambulance. At night, the sick of each division, of whom there were hundreds, would bivouac by the side of some lagoon or small watercourse, the attendants would prepare us some supper, and the surgeons would make their rounds, administering such medicine as the respective cases required. The prevailing type of sickness was malarial fever, for which the sovereign specific seemed to be quinine. As for me, I was exempt from the taking of medicine, for which I was thankful. The surgeon, after inquiring into my case, would sententiously remark, acute rheumatism, and pass on. I was at a loss to understand this seeming neglect, but a sort of explanation was given to me later, which will be mentioned in its order. The food that was given to the sick was meager and very unsatisfactory, but it was probably the best that could be furnished under the circumstances. Each man was given an oyster can full of what seemed to be beef soup, with some rice or barley grains in it. By the time it got around to us, there was usually a thin crust of cold tallow on the top, and the mere looks of the mess were enough to spoil one's appetite, if he had any. One evening, Wallace and I were sitting side by side with our backs against a tree when an attendant came to us and gave each one his can of the decoction above mentioned. It was comical to see the look of disgust that came over the face of poor Enoch. He turned towards me, and tilting his can slightly to enable me to see the contents, spoke thus, "Now, ain't this nice stuff to give a sick man? I've a good notion to throw the whole business in that fellow's face," referring to the attendant. "The trouble with you, Enoch," I said, "is that you are losing your patriotism, and I shouldn't be surprised if you'd turn secesh yet. Kicking on this rich, delicious soup. Next thing you'll be ordering turtle soup and clamoring for napkins and finger bowls. You remind me of a piece of poetry I have read somewhere, something like this. Yeshurun waxed fat, and down his belly hung. Against the government he kicked, and high his buttocks flung." The poor old fellow leaned back against the tree and indulged in a long, silent laugh that really seemed to do him good. I would joke with him after this fashion a good deal, and long afterward, he told me that he believed he would have died on that march if I hadn't kept his spirits up by making ridiculous remarks. In speaking of Wallace as old, the word is used in a comparative sense, for the fact is, he was only about 34 years of age at this time. On the evening of September 9th, the sick of our division bivouacked by the side of a small bayou, in a dense growth of forest trees. The next morning, the rumor spread among us that a battle was impending, that our advance was close to the Confederates, and that a determined effort would be made for the capture of Little Rock. Sure enough, during the forenoon, the cannon began to boom a few miles west of us, and our infantry was seen rapidly moving in that direction. As I lay there, helpless on the ground, I could not avoid worrying somewhat about the outcome of the battle. If our forces should be defeated, we sick fellows would certainly be in a bad predicament. I could see, in my mind's eye, our ambulance starting on a gallop for Deval's Bluff, while every jolt of the conveyance would inflict on me excruciating pain. But this suspense did not last long. The artillery practice soon began moving further westward and was only of short duration anyhow. We saw no stragglers, which was an encouraging sign, and sometime during the afternoon, we learned that all was going in our favor. From the standpoint of a common soldier, I have always thought that General Steele effected the capture of Little Rock with commendable skill and in a manner that displayed sound military judgment. The town was on the west side of the Arkansas River, and our army approached it from the east. General Price, the Confederate commander, had constructed strong breastworks a short distance east of the town and on the east side of the river, commanding the road on which we were approaching. The right of these works rested on the river, and the left on an impassable swamp. But General Steele did not choose to further Price's plans by butting his infantry up against the Confederate works. He entertained him at that point by ostentatious demonstrations and attacked elsewhere. The Arkansas River was very low, in many places not much more than a wide sandbar, and was easily fordable at numerous points. So Steele had his cavalry and some of his infantry ford the river to the west side, below the town, and advance along the west bank, which was not fortified. General Price, seeing that his position was turned and that his line of retreat was in danger of being cut off, withdrew his troops from the east side and evacuated Little Rock about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, retreating southwest. Our troops followed close on his heels, marched in, and took possession of the capital city of the state of Arkansas. Our loss, in the entire campaign, was insignificant, being only a little over 100 in killed, wounded, and missing. The 61st was with the troops that operated on the east side of the river and sustained no loss whatever. A few cannonballs, poorly aimed and flying high, passed over the regiment but did no mischief, beyond shaking the nerves of some recruits who had never before been under fire. About sundown on the evening of the 10th, the ambulance drivers hitched up, and the sick were taken to a division hospital located near the east bank of the river. Captain Keeley came over the next day to see Wallace and myself, and at my urgent request, he arranged for me to be sent to the regiment. As heretofore stated, I just loathed the idea of being in a hospital. There were so many disagreeable and depressing things occurring there every day, which could not be helped, that they inspired in me a sort of desperate determination to get right out of such a place, and stay out, if possible. Early the next morning, an ambulance drove up, I was put in it, and taken to the camp of the old regiment. Some of the boys carried me into a tent and laid me down on a cot, and I was once more in the society of men who were not groaning with sickness but were cheerful and happy. But it was my fate to lie on that cot for more than a month, unable even to turn over without help. I shall never forget the kindness of Frank Gates during that time. He would come every day, when not on duty, and bathe and rub my rheumatic parts with a rag soaked in vinegar, almost scalding hot, which seemed to give me temporary relief. There was an old doctor named Thomas D. Washburn, an assistant surgeon of the 126th Illinois Infantry, who, for some reason, had been detailed to serve temporarily with our regiment, and he would sometimes drop in to see me. He was a tall old man, something over 6 feet high, and gaunt in proportion. I don't remember that he ever gave me any medicine or treatment of any kind, for the reason, doubtless, that will now be stated. One day, I said to him, "Doctor, is there nothing that can be done for me? Must I just lie here and suffer indefinitely?" He looked down at me, sort of sympathetically, and slowly said, "I will answer your question by telling you a little story. Once upon a time, a young doctor asked an old one substantially the same question you have just asked me, which the old doctor answered by saying, 'Yes, there is just one remedy, 6 weeks.' And, patting me lightly on the shoulder, he further remarked, 'That's all.' Then he left." The sequel in my case confirmed Dr. Washburn's story. The spot where the regiment went into camp on the day of the capture of Little Rock was opposite the town, on the east bank of the Arkansas, not far from the river, and in a scattered grove of trees. The locality was supposed to be a sort of suburb of the town and was designated at the time in Army orders as Huntersville. But the only house that I now remember being near our camp was a little, old, ramshackle building that served as a railroad depot. Speaking of the railroad, it extended only from here to Devall's Bluff, a distance of about 50 miles, and was the only railroad at that time in the state of Arkansas. The original project of the road contemplated a line from Little Rock to a point on the Mississippi opposite Memphis. Work was begun on the western terminus, and the road was completed and in operation as far as Devall's Bluff before the war. Then the war came along and the work stopped. Since then, the road has been completed as originally planned. This little old sawed-off railroad was quite a convenience to our army at the Rock, as it obviated what otherwise would have been the necessity of hauling our supplies in wagons across the country from Devall's Bluff. It also frequently came in handy for transporting the troops and several times saved our regiment, and, of course, others, from a hot and tiresome march. For some weeks while in camp at Huntersville, we lived high on several articles of food not included in the army rations. There were a good many sheep in the country roundabout that the military authorities confiscated, and so we had many a feast on fine, fresh mutton. Corn was plentiful also, and cornmeal was issued to us liberally. Last, but not least, the rich Arkansas River bottom lands abounded in great big yellow sweet potatoes that the country people called yams, and we just reveled in them to our entire satisfaction. There was a boy in my company named William Banfield, about the same age as myself. We had been near neighbors at home and intimate friends. Bill was a splendid soldier, seldom sick, and always performed his soldier duties cheerfully and without grumbling. And Bill was blessed with a good digestion and apparently was always hungry. The place where he would build his cook fire in this camp was near the front of my tent, where I had a good view of his operations. I was lying helpless on my cot, and, like others so situated from time immemorial, had nothing to do and scarcely did anything else but watch the neighbors. At the time I am now writing, October 1916, Bill is yet alive and residing at Grafton, Illinois. He is a good old fellow, and long may he wave. That concludes the 11th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.